Today at Deutsche Auto Parts, we're going to be installing an R600 intake on our MK7 GTI. Okay, so before we go into our install, just a few brief notes about this. If you follow our stuff pretty closely, a long time ago, we actually installed the Cup version that Racing Line offers for MK7s on this car a long time ago and did a DIY on that. We are now switching to the R600 intake. This was actually not available in this form when we did that install, which is why we didn't go with the R600 at that time. Closed intakes, in my opinion, are a much better solution for people because keeping a closed system where you get the air coming direct from the grill outside of the car into the intake will give you fresher, cooler air and prevent ambient air from inside the engine to encroach into your intake, keeping your intake charged as cool as possible. So that obviously cooler air is more dense and better for power, which is why we generally recommend closed systems. This is by far our most popular intake that we offer, and that is mostly because it has a real factory look to it, and a lot of people like that kind of OEM plus kind of style. So let's get into our install. Okay, so as we're starting our install, we're going to take off these two Torx screws that hold in this intake duct piece, and there are two T20 Torx screws. We're just going to take them out, and then this will now be loose, and what you need to do is just pop it down to loosen that up, and then we can take that out once we get all the rest of this assembly out. Okay, so now we're going to remove our secondary air intake hose and then this vacuum line. Now, this is going to often take a little bit of struggle to actually pull that off, so you might want to use a pick, or we also have these, which are hose pliers. They also are super convenient there too, but what you might want to do is get a pick like this, like a 90, and kind of get it underneath, and then you can kind of rotate it around to help you get it off. This is on there pretty good, so you're going to need to do some working to get this off all the way. So now that's off. And all you need to do to take this off is squeeze and then pull it off. There are these two clips on the top and bottom that actually hold it in place. Now we're going to take this spring clamp off. Now this goes between the airbox itself and then the turbo inlet. Now we have these spring clamp pliers. I'll put a link to them where you can check them out, but you don't need these. But dealing with these spring clamps, if you try to use regular pliers, what will happen is as you try to grab them, and the pliers will actually slip off. So what these are is one side that has kind of a hook to go around it and then a hole for the other one to go in. So they hold those spring clamps pretty well. And then all we're going to do is pop that off like so. All right, so now that all of these hoses are off and this is loose, the only thing holding this in place are the grommets on the bottom of the intake. There are just some grommets that hold on to some nubs that actually mount them in place. So all we're going to do to remove those is to pop them up and pull up on the intake like this. And as you can see, once you get that out, everything kind of comes out there. This kind of just hooks up and swings out. Now we have the ability to take this duct out, and all we're going to do is pop up this coolant hose out of its bracket. You want to be careful with this coolant hose because on this side there's a nipple that goes to the upper radiator hose, and if you pull too hard on it, that could snap that off. Okay, so now we're going to install our intake. Now before we do that, we have this hose on the bottom of our original intake, and there is a hole in the bottom of our R600 to mount that hose in place. So we're going to do so, and then you can check out what the orientation you need for that hose to get it mounted in place. So we're going to install our intake now. I know this is going to be probably the most challenging part of the install right here for most people. This is obviously an intake, so it's not crazy challenging, but what I found is that this can only be installed with the cover mounted already, because if you fail to do it any other way, you will not be able to get it mounted in place, the top cover, into this section of the radiator support right here. So what we need to do is get that swung in place. Now, what actually is probably easier is to take that hose off, can kind of rotate it and then mount that hose back in place on the bottom here. So we've gotten that hose mounted back on the bottom of our airbox, and what I found is this is the side you need to worry about. So you want to kind of fit the airbox top on top of the bottom, and then leave that top section out, and then get this lower section rotated in place. And you kind of have to get it popped down like that, and then you can push this towards the side, and then the whole intake will shift over there. Once you get that done, obviously now you have to get this side in place and then pulled forward. Now we have that already mounted in place, and we can pop the grommets that are on the bottom of this intake to the place where they belong. So once you're lined up, you can just double check to make sure. Look inside, they're both lined up, and all we need to do to make that happen is to pop that in place like that. Now we can install our filter. All right, so now that our filter box is mounted in place, you can see it's still able to move up and down, and we need that to be able to happen still, because this filter basically is what creates the back end of this housing with the back of the filter right here. So since that creates that seal, you need to make sure that obviously it's mounted into this channel properly to ensure that everything is going to be sealing correctly. So what we're going to do is take that and slide that up, and this has a correct orientation, and there is a nipple on top that you want to be facing upwards. So we can slide that into our hose here, and then we can pop our filter in place and then slide it down. Now again, you should see that all the way around the back of this, that it's pretty solidly square in there. And then what we can do is pop this housing back in place to close it up the rest of the way. Now, the last part we have to do with this section right here is to get this hose mounted in place. Now, we're not going to be installing, there's a smooth hose that VWR offers, which we'll link to just so you can check it out, but we're not going to be installing that today on this vehicle. And all we're going to do is take our spring clamp pliers, and mount that back in place. Okay, so now we have two things to deal with. One of them being the secondary air pipe, the other one being this vacuum hose that you pulled off the original intake. On the R600 intake, that filter that we just slid in place actually has a nipple on the back right here that it actually has to route to. So, just so we can show you, if you can route around the intake there, but it doesn't really have a great path to follow there. So what I like to do is go underneath this harness right here, and it gives it a lot more freedom to move around, and then we can just slide that vacuum line right onto that nipple. Now we're going to get this mounted in place. This is our secondary air intake hose, and all we're going to do is slide that in place. Now, something to keep in mind, this is a GTI, a Golf 1.8T, which uses this same intake, would also have same location of a secondary air hose. If you have a Golf R, your vehicle does not have secondary air, so you would get the other intake, which is a non-secondary air one. We'll put a link to both versions in the description so you can check them out. And to get this mounted in place, all we're going to do is slide that in place, and we should be all set there. Now that we have all of that stuff mounted on, we can pop our cover back in place. And once you get on the studs, all you're going to do is pop it down. And then we have all of our torque screws that mount this cover in place that can then be screwed in place. Now, make sure before you put them in place, obviously, that you have the cover mounted all how it needs to be mounted. And again, that your filter is correctly seated in place before you start screwing these down. So, I'm just going to pop one down. Now, one note I want to make, We actually left these all loose before we finalized tightening them all down, because I found that that's the easiest way to get them all mounted in place. So we're going to finalize tightening down the rest of our screws. And now we have completed our VWR intake install. Thank you so much for watching our Racing Line R600 intake install. Again, links to all the intakes as well as other products talked about in this video in the description below. Thank you so much to Racing Line for this intake to give us the ability to make this install video for you guys. Again, any support through purchases like this or any others help support videos just like this one. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more like it.